All wars leave us with myths.
But few are so glamorized as the ones we got from the Revolutionary War. Buckle up, this is going to be a bumpy ride. Who can forget the Boston bar tab brawl? Oh, you don't? See, that's just good marketing. Here's how the story went down. A 13-year-old started yelling at a soldier about an unpaid bar tab. The bar bill was actually paid, so the soldier did the reasonable thing to the snotty-nosed kid and hit him in the head with a musket. That was a prelude to the later action. A bunch of guys at the Boston Customs House, not wanting to miss out on the fun, later started throwing snowballs at a soldier. But instead of throwing snowballs back, he called for help. 7 more soldiers showed up, but also about 50 locals showed up on the snowball team. To be utterly fair, there's a couple of different versions of exactly what happened next, but without doubt, the soldiers opened fire. When the melee ended, 5 people were dead and 3 were wounded, and that's what we now call the Boston Massacre. So why the dramatic name? You could call it a bit of an insurgent propaganda. It's hard to work the public into a frenzy over the Boston bar tab brawl, so Boston Massacre it was. And today we remember those 5 deaths on March 5th, 1770 as nothing less than the first casualties of the American Revolution. On December 16, 1773, a bunch of guys disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded a ship belonging to the East India Company and dumped 340 crates of tea into Boston Harbor. Hell yeah, right? That'll show those stuffy Brits. Or will it? Today, this act of supposedly patriotic hooliganism has passed pretty firmly into national myth. But stop for a second and think about what it really sounds like. Does that sound like legitimately rousing rebellion? Or does it sound like the stuff of a Buffalo Bills tailgate? Remember, in those days, Americans were still very British culturally. So when they found out about the ransacking at the harbor, they mostly just sneered and thought to themselves, what a waste of good tea. There's 2 major takeaways from the Boston Tea Party. First, it was far from the incident that ignited independence fever. The other is a bit more complicated. The Boston Tea Party wasn't about taxes on tea. Most people logically think that. But taxes on British tea had actually been recently cut, making it a lot cheaper than it had been before. So what were those mohawked-clad colonists mad about? The new cheap tea was putting the screws to John Hancock's smuggling business. Yeah, the guy best known for his 17-font-sized Times New Roman was smuggling duty-free tea from the Dutch Republic, specifically the Holland part. So that cheap British tea had to go. Here's a part of the story you don't know. The Boston Tea Party was a copycat. The first Tea Party was in Charleston, South Carolina. The Sons of Liberty seized a ship there and held the contents, again, so as to not mess with the tea smuggling. Freedom. The colonists might have been a ragtag bunch of rebels and mountain men, but they weren't naive. They knew England was big, bad, and had already conquered half the world, and they knew they had no chance against the well-supplied, well-trained, and well-paid British army, so they asked for help. They called on Britain's longtime BEF, best enemy forever, France, and the gamble paid off. At first, France took a cagey approach. They didn't want England to know they were helping the colonists, so they concocted a fake business to funnel gunpowder, cannons, and clothing to American soldiers. In fact, around 90% of the gunpowder America used in the 2 years after the Declaration of Independence came directly from that fake French business. When it looked like colonists might actually win, France started to flex more publicly. Call them fair-weather fans if you want, but the French infantry actually played a big role in the decisive 1781 victory over the British at Yorktown. After that, Spain got involved. They were still ticked off at England for beating them in the 7 Years' War. Then the Dutch Republic, aka modern-day Netherlands, got on board, and pretty soon the war was over. America was an independent nation, but it depended on a whole gaggle of other nations to actually make it happen. Today, it's hard to imagine anyone in the colonies wanting to be ruled by an all-powerful, self-absorbed British king. But for a lot of people, it was just easier that way. And we do mean a lot of people. As fun as it is to imagine literally everyone in America heave-hoing their way to independence, there were way more loyalists in the colonies than most people think. It wasn't even a 50-50 question, but how were people really split? Some buy into the framework, popularly thought to have been laid out by John Adams, that the split among the populace was into 3 equal parts. Patriots who wanted independence, loyalists who supported the crown, and the always annoying undecideds.
This is a time for choosing sides.
The best estimates of who supported whom come from historian Robert Calhoun, who calls the split at around 20% loyalist, 45% patriot, and 35% undecided. So the rebels weren't a minority, but at the same time, the support for independence was hardly overwhelming. And the patriots and loyalists weren't buddies in a let's agree to disagree sort of relationship either. They fought, physically. There were even a few regional mini-civil wars that took the lives of Americans who would have been better served standing together in common cause. Early in the war, middle-class farmers were the backbone of the armed forces, but the fighting took a while, the seasons changed, and eventually they were like, I gotta go home and plant some stuff. So the idea that the soldiers were in it for the good of the potential new nation is, well, untrue. What are the colonist leaders gonna do? The war wasn't stopping and America needed soldiers. So the patriots did what needed to be done and dangled every carrot they could think of to bring on replacements, including a place for those carrots. When things started looking bad for Washington and his exhausted, overstretched army, Congress offered men who enlisted for, quote, the duration, the generous sum of $20 a suit and 100 acres. Not bad. Farmland in America today is worth on average around $3,000 per acre, so this is a pretty good deal if you manage to survive. In a sense, those land grants, for lack of a better word, helped Americans settle in new lands like Kentucky, Ohio, and Georgia, for example. The Virginia land grant specifically settled Kentucky, which was still part of Virginia at the time. The image of the Liberty Bell tolling to announce the signing of the Declaration of Independence is iconic, and the actual Liberty Bell still attracts a lot of tourists to Philadelphia. But would you believe that the actual Liberty Bell didn't actually ring on July 4th, 1776? Of course you would. No joyous bells tolled in Philadelphia until July 8th, when the people were invited to hear the first reading of the Declaration. But even then, it might not have been the Liberty Bell that brought people to the town square. At the time, the Liberty Bell was high up in a rotting wooden steeple. Philadelphians were afraid that if they rang it, the whole tower would collapse and kill someone. That would not have been a good way to kick things off. The story of the ringing of the Liberty Bell wasn't even a thing until 1847, when it appeared in a short story by novelist George Lippard, who called it the State House Bell. People didn't really start calling it the Liberty Bell until around 1876. So not only did the bell probably not ring out to celebrate the hard-won liberty of all white male Americans, it wasn't even associated with the word liberty until a century later. And how did it get that huge crack? Turns out that's always been there. Even so, it's still a nice old bell that's seen some things, so if you're in the area, you should go look at it. Now, everyone knows one of the biggest disagreements between the colonies and Great Britain had to do with taxes. So hearing that, we kind of just assumed that the tax rate was ridiculously high, up there in the half your crop and your eldest kid tax bracket. But that's another wrong assumption. On average, the colonists had to pay roughly 1 shilling per year in taxes, which is about $3.20 per year today. In contrast, people who lived in Great Britain back then paid around 26 shillings a year, or around $83.20 today. So why all the whining? The truth is, the colonists weren't mad about high taxes, they were mad about being tax-paying citizens without a representative in Parliament.
Taxation without representation, you know?
It'd be sort of like paying a fee for internet access but not being allowed to use it. Kind of like a legalized stick-up. It's a stick-up for a shilling per year, the kind of money you might not lean down to pick up if you saw it on the street, but it's the principle of the matter.
People of Boston would be lining up to pay taxes if they're represented in Parliament.
That's a nice thought, Hancock, but lining up to pay taxes? Come on, get real. July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, no one rang the Liberty Bell, and then freedom spread across the land, right? No. The Declaration did get signed that day, but think about what a declaration is. It's a declaration, not an agreement. You can declare anything you want, but getting other people on board is a different story. In this case, the Declaration was meant to inform the British Empire that Americans no longer considered themselves British subjects or bound by British law. Obviously, the British were not cool with this. You could even say they did not care at all. The Declaration of Independence was signed 442 days after the first engagements of the Revolutionary War, the battles of Lexington and Concord, but 5 years before the war actually ended. It would be 7 long years before the US would be officially free when the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3rd, 1783. So really, the fireworks and barbecues should probably happen a couple months later than they do right now. Or if we could have another holiday, that'd work too. One of the enduring legends of the Revolutionary War is the one about how the colonists, who knew the terrain much better than the British, hid in the woods and picked off the Redcoats with rifles, winning the war guerrilla style. It's true that Americans had been fighting Native Americans for 150 years, so they understood how to fight in the wilderness. They'd learned some tricks that had most definitely not been passed down over centuries of traditional European warfare. But the British had plenty of experience fighting the Scots in similar terrain, and they'd already fought in America during the 7 Years' War. I feel like you might be confused by that name. This is the second time we brought it up. So the global war that lasted 6 years and 8 months is the 7 Years' War. Specifically in North America, that part of the war is known as the French and Indian War. So yes, guerrilla tactics played a role in the American Revolution, but they didn't win the war.
We have to attack the British on Christmas night. They're gonna be drunk, they're gonna be burping.
In fact, the colonists deliberately exercised restraint when it came to non-traditional warfare. They saw themselves as living in a golden age of civility and wealth, and guerrilla warfare didn't fit that worldview. So they won the war the old-fashioned way, out in the field in formation, marching straight at the enemy. Terrible tactics in retrospect, but in their minds, it helped maintain their sense of dignity and civility as they got shot at, fixed bayonets, and tried to kill everyone they could see. What is a Minuteman? Before you answer, this is a family show, so just don't. According to the lore, these were highly skilled, highly effective military volunteers who could be ready for duty with a mere 60-second heads up. They were highly trained and terrifyingly accurate with a rifle. They were the best of the best, and everybody knew it. By now you know where this is going. Yes, Minutemen were real, they had more training than your run-of-the-mill militiamen. But they were far from special on the battlefield. They had no central leadership, very little discipline, and for the most part couldn't hit the broadside of a barn from 10 feet away. It wasn't entirely their fault. There were actually very few rifles around. The Minutemen were mostly using muskets, which could turn just about anyone into a terrible shot. Flintlocks were in use, but accuracy with a flintlock required a lot of practice, and practice was out because gunpowder was saved for real fighting. Minutemen were said to have played an important role in the battles of Lexington and Concord, but the numbers really aren't that impressive. Just 73 British killed and 174 injured. That sounds like a lot, but according to the Revolutionary War Journal, around 75,000 shots were fired that day. By their calculation, that means about 1 in 300 shots hit their mark, or a mark anyway. And those guys were firing at close range. So when you watch a movie about the Revolution and you see two armies marching straight toward each other and you wonder how anyone survived, no, the reason why is this. They were bad shots with lousy guns.
Going muzzle to muzzle with Redcoats in open field, it's madness.
So why the legend of the sharpshooting Minutemen? Again, it's just marketing. If you want to boost morale and inspire young men to enlist, you gotta make your side sound as cool as humanly possible. That's the American way. You can put the Minutemen on the shelf right up there with Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, which didn't happen, and the story of Molly Pitcher, who probably didn't exist, but we'll save those for next time.